listeners, and welcome to the 57th lecture in this NPTEL course on 20th century poetry. In the previous lecture, I introduced the figure of Derek Walcott, and I began discussing his poem, The Ruins of a Great House. I will briefly conclude that discussion and move on to a discussion of Omeros, which is his magnum opus. I'll make some comments on the literary and historical references that Ruins of a Great House contains, because that will help us understand Derek Walcott's impulse and his burden as an English poet from the Caribbean. It is this impulse and this burden which will give the right frame and right background for an understanding of Omeros. So, what is this poem about, Ruins of a Great House? In this poem, the speaker observes the decay of a great house somewhere in England. It is a house that's old, that is getting older, that is, it is decaying. And in that decay, the poet is reminded of figures, writers, poets, books, words, and the history of the world, in which the poet is placed in a very particular relationship with this house in England, and through this relationship, the poet is placed in a particular relationship with the history of writing in the English language. And it is the poet's realization of the peculiarity of this relationship which gives the poem its unique power. The poet is filled with a strange mix of anger, frustration, and sadness, and the eloquence of the poem emerges from this combination of feelings and the particular way in which Derek Walcott is able to use language to articulate this combination of feelings. So, what are the literary references? The first literary reference is to a text by a writer named Brown titled Urn Burial. There are other references such as the quote, "Farewell green fields, farewell ye happy groves" to Robert Browning. There are more references to Faulkner, William Faulkner, the writer from the American South, and the phrase that Walcott uses is "marble like Greece, like Faulkner's South in stone." All of these references are about how historical monuments are the carriers of violent history. In Faulkner's South, there is a deep history of violence which is signaled and hidden by the landscape, by the plantations in rural Mississippi. The same thing Derek Walcott witnesses in this house in England. There are other phrases like, "A spade below dead leaves will wring the bone of some dead animal or human thing fallen from evil days, from evil times." So the fact that there are dead leaves, which is a sign of decay, but it is a very comforting, homely, domesticated decay. Dead leaves are something that are cleared by homeowners every season. It is among the minor occupational hazards of owning a house, and it is something that homeowners look forward to without any great unpleasantness. But the point Walcott is making is that while clearing the dead leaves with a spade, just below the surface of the soil, the spade will hit something else. It will hit a bone of some dead animal or human thing. What does this say? It's a horrific image. It's a very frightening image, and it signifies for Walcott the fact that the prosperity, the success, the comfort, the civilization of England was built on the backs of violence. Violence that was committed to both animals and human beings who were considered less valuable. And it is the corpses, the dead bodies of these animals and human beings that are quite literally buried under the surface of England. Literally, this is true because dead animals are often buried in the estate or in the grounds of the estate. It is also true metaphorically and philosophically because the wealth of England came from the exploitation of human beings and resources in the colonies. So, this is a history that the poet is reminded of constantly as he goes about observing this estate. There are other references to writers such as Rudyard Kipling. Walcott says, I heard what Kipling heard, the death of a great empire, the abuse of ignorance by Bible and by sword. So, anger that the poet feels is combined with a sort of sadness that the greatness of this British Empire was very short lived. And the poet relates to the sadness of these people who realized that however much the empire was successful, it was coming to an end. There are other references to people such as Hawkins, Walter Raleigh, and Drake. And Derek Walcott, or his poetic persona, calls these figures ancestral murderers and poets, more perplexed in memory now by every ulcerous crime. So, more perplexed in memory. So, once they were murderers and poets, but today one feels not simply anger or indignation, but a kind of sadness that they are dead and gone and they no longer have the power. And even the world that they created through their violence no longer survives with as much strength or stability. So, the British Empire is crumbling. It was crumbling even when these people were alive, but its decay has reached a new low at the time that the poet is observing this estate and writing these words. The poet then says, the rot remains with us, the men are gone. But as dead ash is lifted in a wind that fans the blackening ember of the mind, my eyes burned from the ashen prose of done. So it's a combination of several things. On one hand, the men are gone, but even though they are gone, the violence that they committed and the consequences of their violence are not gone. They are very much present. And so the death of these men is not really a comfort to those who were harassed by them when they were alive. That is the first thought. But the second is that this form in which the dead, the violent dead, exist, it is a much less intense version. They no longer have the power to create the unpleasantness or the violence that they did when they were alive. So, dead ash is lifted in a wind. So, the memory of the violence of these violent men is like the dead ash that is lifted in a wind. And the memory of violence is kindled as if the wind would kindle a blackening ember, right? So when an ember or a piece of coal or wood has been burning for a long time, it tends to blacken and die. It needs a fresh supply of oxygen in order to start burning again. The poet likens the history and the memory of colonialism to this wind which gives a fresh energy to a flame that has been dying. So, what exactly is the flame? The poet's creative impulse or the poet's historical memory of colonialism. Both of these things are embers that are dying and they need to be re intensified. They need to be given a new lease of life by the wind. So, history is the wind which kindles the creative impulse of the poet. That's the point that Derek Walcott is making here. And in this rekindling of his creative impulses, Walcott remembers another poet, John Donne, and Walcott writes, my eyes burned from the ashen prose of Donne. Ablaze with rage, I thought, some slave is rotting in this manorial lake. But still the coal of my compassion fought, that Albion too was once a colony like ours, part of the continent, piece of the main. So the poet's anger is instantly combined with a sort of empathy, or if not empathy, then a sort of sympathy, because the poet realizes that just like the Caribbean today has been colonized and is living in the aftermath of a neo-colonial impulse, similarly, the, the source of that colonial violence, England, was once a colony. So there is a cycle, it seems, an endlessly repeating cycle of historical violence. England, those of you who know the history of the Roman Empire, will know that what is England today was once a province, a neglected, uncivilized part of the Roman Empire. England was once a colony of Rome. And Walcott remembers that history, and that's why Walcott uses the word Albion. Albion is a very old name of England. Before England was civilized and Christianized, it was a neglected area of the Roman Empire. And the phrase that Walcott uses to describe what England was in ancient Rome is a phrase that Walcott borrows from John Donne. And the phrase is part of the continent, piece of the main. And so Walcott finds that anger is replaced by compassion in the end. And this is how Walcott puts it. All in compassion ends so differently from what the heart arranged, as well as if a manner of thy friends. So this is how the poem ends, and let us quickly go over some of the historical references. The phrase urn burial is the shortened metonymic version of a longer title, which is Hydriotaphia, urn burial, or a discourse of the sepulchral urns lately found in Norfolk. This was the title of a work by the English polymath Thomas Browne. It was published in the year 1658 as the first part of a two-part work that concludes with the Garden of Cyrus. The pretext for the book is the archaeological discovery of Anglo-Saxon pottery in Norfolk, with Browne describing the antiquities. He then provides a survey of funerary customs, both ancient and those current to his own era. In describing human nature, Browne notes the tendency of humans to solemnize both births and deaths, using their pompous graves to establish their self-importance. Disjecta membra is a phrase that Walcott uses. It's a very important phrase, and we need to understand its historical and literary origins. Disjecta membra is a Latin phrase meaning scattered remains or scattered limbs. It often refers to the remnants of a literary work, like a poem or manuscript, that have been broken or dispersed. The phrase is derived from Horace's Disjecti membra poetae, which translates from Latin to English as limbs of a dismembered poet. In essence, Disjecta membra signifies scattered remains. It implies a state of being broken apart or dispersed, like pieces of a puzzle or fragments of a whole. While Disjecta membra can refer to physical remnants, it's most commonly used in the context of literature, particularly ancient writings, to describe surviving fragments. So, in this case, when Walcott uses Disjecta membra, he is referring to both how the consequences of Britain's empire are scattered across the world. That is one sense in which the word Disjecta membra is used. Quotes from English poets filtering down through the education system to Derek Walcott, a black male poet from St. Lucia in the Caribbean. The phrases from the English poets that Walcott remembers, they are Disjecta membra. The body from which they have been scattered, or the body of which these are the scattered and dismembered limbs, is English literature as a colonial institution. Another sense in which Disjecta membra is used is to refer to the books like Thomas Brown's On Burial, which no longer survive in their original composition. The memory of Walcott as a student of a colonial cultural education is a fragmentary memory. Walcott remembers phrases, but not the whole thing. And this is another form of fragmentation, which the poem does not necessarily seek to restore. Now, who are these people? Hawkins, Walter Raleigh, and Drake. Now, Hawkins can refer to several individuals. Several people named Hawkins were associated with the British Empire. Two most notable among these are John Hawkins and William Hawkins. John Hawkins was a prominent figure in Elizabethan England, known for his role in the Royal Navy and his involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. William Hawkins, on the other hand, was an early representative of the English East India Company, seeking trading privileges in India during the reign of the Mughal Emperor Jahangir. So these are two individuals, two possible and likely candidates for the word Hawkins. Whatever may be the individual, or it's also possible that Walcott was referring to both. But the point is that Walcott refers to individuals who played a very instrumental role in spreading the British Empire, and they did that by inflicting violence on people from Africa, Latin America, and Asia. They played a very important role in the transatlantic slave trade. John Hawkins made voyages in the 1560s, capturing Africans and selling them into slavery in the Spanish colonies in the Americas. There was also a lot of naval innovations. Hawkins designed and built ships for the Royal Navy. So these are people who played a very big role in creating the British Empire. William Hawkins was a part of the East India Company's envoy. William Hawkins was a captain in the service of the English East India Company. In 1608, he sailed to India aboard the ship Hector, seeking permission to establish trading posts. William Hawkins met with the Mughal Emperor Jahangir in the city of Agra to negotiate trading rights for the English East India Company. So, as we can see, these historical figures played a very important role in establishing the global spread of the British Empire. Now, moving on to the second individual named, so Walter Raleigh was an English statesman, soldier, writer, and explorer. He was born in the year 1553 and passed away in 1618. He was one of the most notable figures of the Elizabethan era. He played a leading part in English colonization of North America, suppressed rebellion in Ireland, helped defend England against the Spanish Armada, and held political positions under Queen Elizabeth I. So again, a very, very important figure in the colonial in establishing the colonial power of England. Walter Raleigh also had a strong connection to the Caribbean through his expeditions in search of the mythical city of El Dorado. He was also involved in early English colonization of the Caribbean. Raleigh explored the Orinoco River in present-day Venezuela and Guyana, and he hoped to find gold and establish English presence in the region. He also engaged in naval actions against Spanish ships in the Caribbean, furthering England's rivalry with Spain. Now, coming to the last historical figure, Sir Francis Drake. He was a prominent figure of the Elizabethan era and played a significant role in the British Empire's expansion into the Caribbean through his exploits as an explorer, privateer, and naval commander. His actions, while often celebrated in England, were a source of conflict with Spain and contributed to the Anglo-Spanish Wars. Drake also had strong connections to the Caribbean. Drake's career in the Caribbean began with privateering expeditions authorized by Queen Elizabeth I to attack Spanish ships and settlements. His successful raids on Spanish ports and treasure fleets, such as the one on Nombre de Dios a key silver port, earned him significant wealth and recognition in England. These raids were a direct challenge to Spanish dominance in the region and contributed to growing tensions between England and Spain. So we can see that Walcott is referring to individuals who quite literally created the British Empire. They did so by inflicting violence on black and brown bodies. They also did so by shaping the Caribbean as it began to take on a modern shape. In a way, referring to these historical figures is a way for the poet to reckon with his own history, with the history of the Caribbean, and to show the connections between himself as a poet from the Caribbean, who is observing this great house already in ruins in England. The poet's point is that these individuals created him through acts of violence, and now that he's in England, he's accessing English culture and history through the memory of violence that these English men inflicted. Now, the final reference in the last stanza is to John Donne's Meditation number 17, in which Donne uses the phrase, part of the continent, piece of the main. And the last phrase with which Walcott's poem ends, as well as if a manner of thy friends, is taken from John Donne's poem, No Man is an Island, and I'll briefly read that. John Donne writes, No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a piece of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manner of thy friends or of thine own were. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never sent to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee, as well as if a manner of thy friends. So, what's the point of this reference? This poem by Donne emphasizes the interconnection, the interconnectedness of all human beings, but also the fact that there is no action that any one human being can undertake which will not have a consequence for other human beings, however far they may be in the world. In a way, the poet quotes this idea and this evokes this idea from John Donne in order to counter the anger that he feels for these violent English profiteers, colonizers, and poets. The logic is that today he is what he is, that is, a poet observing this house in England, which means that he has achieved a considerable degree of material and financial success. Derek Walcott has achieved success as an English poet. He has accomplished himself in the art of using the English language to write poems. He is connected to other English poets who were quite violent. He is aware that in the past, English poets have inflicted violence on Derek Walcott's ancestors, his people, his land, the place that he calls home. So he is implicated in a very problematic history. And now that he is privileged enough to make a choice to allow himself to feel anger about this legacy, he is reminded that he must counter his anger with a kind of compassion. And what is that compassion? That compassion is for everyone who is given a privilege without asking if they would like to have the privilege in that form. And in this particular very, very unique frame, Walcott realizes that he has a lot in common with these murderers and poets, as he calls Drake, Raleigh, and Hawkins. And he finds a lot of compassion in the words of John Donne, because he understands that human beings often don't have a great deal of choice in changing the circumstances in which they find themselves. Right? History is what happens, but history is also the limited choices that human beings have in shaping their circumstances. As a privileged poet implicated in a violent history of English literature as well as the British Empire, Walcott realizes that he owes a lot of his success to the British Empire. And he is struggling to reconcile his anger at the violence committed in the name of the British Empire with the enabling power that the English language and English literature especially gives to him, to Derek Walcott as a poet. One way out of this struggle is to remember with compassion the words of John Donne, who says that we are all connected. This is a vision of universal humanity that Walcott finds very difficult to accept because he cannot quite shake from his mind the idea that that the British Empire, which created English literature, was also quite violent. So the poem is a struggle to reconcile different perspectives, and ultimately it describes the burden carried by a black male poet. The burden is how to write well, how to write great poetry, while being fully aware of the violent history of English literature. So that is the end. We will wrap up our discussion of this poem and move on to another topic, slightly related but very interesting, slightly different also, but very, very interesting, which is that of Omeros. What is Omeros? Omeros is a book-length poem that Derek Walcott published in the year 1990. It is perhaps the most ambitious work of Caribbean literature in the 20th century. It is a long poem. It is a sprawling, polyphonic poem that simultaneously invokes and interrogates the legacy of the Homeric epic. Though its title gestures explicitly to Homer, that is, Omeros being the Greek for Homer, the poem is not merely a Caribbean retelling of the Iliad or the Odyssey. Instead, the poem is an intricate meditation on history, colonialism, exile, and identity. It is woven through a poetics of place that is distinctively Caribbean in both texture and scope. Formally, Omeros is remarkable because it fuses classical and Caribbean traditions. It is written in a loose approximation of terza rima. The terza rima consists of 3-line stanzas without strict rhyme. This is why it is Walcott's use of the terza rima is a loose approximation. It is not a strict or very obedient adherence to Dante's use of the rhyme scheme. In which case, in Dante, the lines are rhymed much more strictly. Walcott's use of the terza rima invokes the formal inheritance of Dante as much as Homer, suggesting a global literary genealogy. Not just global, but very particularly Western European literary genealogy. And here we can easily remember what T.S. Eliot had to say about the genesis and the practice of poetry. According to T.S. Eliot, every young person trying to become a poet must first read widely and internalize the mind of Europe. So we can see how Derek Walcott is following T.S. Eliot, but also complicating things. So Walcott is trying very much to be a great poet in the way that T.S. Eliot, a very, very titanic figure of 20th century poetry, had defined how a writer can become a great poet. But Walcott goes much further than T.S. Eliot's prescription and produces a great deal of complexity in his poem. Walcott deliberately fractures and reconfigures this European history and brings it into tension. The literary history of European literature is brought into tension with something that is quite beyond Europe, which are the oral traditions, the rhythms and landscapes of St. Lucia, the island in the Caribbean where Derek Walcott was born and which he called home. This hybridity in form, the hybridity of combining European genealogy with local Caribbean cultures and traditions, mirrors the poem's thematic concern with cultural creolization, historical fragmentation, and the possibilities of post-colonial reinvention. We will continue this discussion in the next lecture and also wrap up our discussion of Omeros. Thank you.